What happens when one of Hollywood's most outspoken and controversial stars, Alec Baldwin, known for his fiery temper and sharp tongue, sits down for what should be a routine interview only to find himself in a heated battle with daytime television's most aggressive host? What started as promotional banter quickly spiraled into a fiery clash that Baldwin did something he'd never done before in his career. You're about to witness one of the most explosive and uncomfortable moments in daytime television history. Alec Baldwin, Hollywood's most outspoken and controversial star whose sharp tongue and fiery temper have made him both legendary and polarizing, was about to face something that would push him past his breaking point. The seasoned actor who has spent recent years dealing with unimaginable personal tragedy and legal scrutiny, who has tried to rebuild his career while navigating the most difficult chapter of his life, was about to encounter a host who seemed determined to exploit his pain for television ratings. For decades, Alec Baldwin has been known for his quick wit and willingness to speak his mind. He's handled tough interviews with his trademark intelligence, faced difficult questions with sharp responses, and never backed down from a verbal sparring match. But recent events had changed everything for the veteran actor, forcing him to approach public appearances with unprecedented caution. On this particular morning at the View studio, Hollywood's most controversial figure would face a different kind of challenge entirely. This wasn't going to be about his latest project, his impressive range as an actor, or even his approach to his craft. This was going to be a calculated attack on his character, his tragedy, and his very right to continue working in an industry that thrives on scandal. What you're about to see isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is what happens when someone mistakes a person's worst nightmare for entertainment fodder, when a host decides that attacking someone's personal tragedy makes for compelling television. The man who has given us memorable performances across film, television, and stage was about to show everyone exactly why his reputation for intensity was completely justified when someone crossed the ultimate line. The View studio was about to become the scene of a confrontation that would leave everyone questioning how far someone should be allowed to go when exploiting another person's darkest moment. The morning atmosphere at ABC's Manhattan studios felt charged with tension as Alec Baldwin arrived with his characteristic sharp intelligence and guarded professionalism. The veteran actor moved through the backstage corridors with the careful awareness of someone who had learned that every public appearance now carried enormous risk, his keen eyes scanning every face with the wariness of someone who had been through hell. "Good morning," he said quietly to the crew members he encountered, his distinctive voice carrying just enough warmth to be polite while maintaining professional distance. There was something different about his demeanor now. The easy confidence of his earlier career tempered by the hard-earned caution of someone who had lived through unimaginable circumstances. His publicist walked closely beside him, her tension barely concealed as she reviewed her notes one final time. "Alec, remember they promised to keep things focused on a new project. Just talk about the work, maybe mention how good it feels to be back on set, and we can get through this smoothly." Baldwin nodded with that familiar intelligence, his weathered face showing the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving public scrutiny at its worst. "Keep it professional," he replied with measured control. "Talk about the craft, stay on message, and get out without any drama." The makeup artist approached him with obvious respect, clearly aware she was working with someone whose recent experiences had changed him fundamentally. "Mr. Baldwin, just some light work to help with the studio lighting." He sat perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead with the kind of controlled alertness that suggested he was already preparing for whatever might come his way. The studio fell to a cautious quiet as Baldwin made his entrance, his commanding presence immediately filling the space with an electric tension. The audience reaction was notably mixed, some enthusiastic applause, some polite acknowledgement, and some obvious uncertainty about how to respond to such a controversial figure. He settled into the guest chair with the careful posture of someone who understood he was walking into potentially hostile territory, his famous intensity carefully controlled beneath a professional facade. Everything felt like two verbal fighters preparing to test each other's limits. But Joy Behar sat quietly observing, her expression suggesting she was about to turn this encounter into something far more personal and destructive than anyone had anticipated. "So, Alec," Whoopi began with careful professionalism, "tell us about getting back to work on this new project. How does it feel to be in front of the cameras again?" Baldwin's weathered face showed measured consideration as he processed the question, clearly grateful for the safe opening. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been through extraordinary circumstances and was trying to rebuild. "It feels good to be working again, Whoopi," he said with controlled sincerity. "Acting has always been my refuge, my way of making sense of the world. Getting back to that creative process, working with talented people who believe in the story we're telling. It's been healing." The audience listened with respectful attention, many clearly sympathetic to someone who had endured such public scrutiny. His hands remained still as he spoke, every gesture measured and thoughtful. "This particular role allowed me to explore some complex emotions," he continued, offering more detail. "Sometimes life experiences, even the most difficult ones, can inform your work in ways you never expected. That's what happened here." Throughout this careful exchange, Joy Behar had remained conspicuously silent. While the other hosts nodded respectfully at Baldwin's thoughtful responses, Joy sat back with her arms folded, studying him with an intensity that seemed to be waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. Finally, after several minutes of respectful discussion, Joy shifted forward in her chair. The movement was subtle, but it immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Baldwin's sharp eyes fixed on her with laser-like focus, and the other hosts grew noticeably more tense. "Alec," Joy said, her voice carrying a sharpness that cut through the careful respect that had defined the conversation, "I have to ask you about the elephant in the room. Your ongoing legal situation with the shooting incident. Don't you think it's inappropriate for you to be out here promoting projects when there are still so many unanswered questions about what happened on that set?" The studio temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, and Baldwin's controlled expression shifted to something much more guarded and dangerous as he realized this wasn't going to be the professional interview he had been promised. Baldwin's controlled composure remained intact, but there was an immediate shift in his posture as he processed Joy's calculated attack on his most painful experience. His hands gripped the arms of his chair slightly tighter, and when he spoke, his voice carried that dangerous undertone that anyone familiar with his work would recognize as a warning. "Joy, that's a tragic accident that's being handled through the proper legal channels," he replied with measured control, his words coming out slow and deliberate. "I'm not going to discuss an ongoing legal matter on daytime television, and frankly, I don't think that's appropriate." Joy sensed she had found her opening and pressed forward with the aggressive instinct of someone who had identified what she thought was a vulnerable target. Her voice took on a sharper, more confrontational tone as she leaned into what was clearly becoming an interrogation rather than an interview. "But Alec, don't you think the public has a right to understand how someone in your position, with your history of aggressive behavior, ended up in a situation where someone died?" she continued, her words cutting deep. "This isn't just about legal proceedings. It's about personal responsibility and accountability." The other hosts exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing that Joy was crossing professional boundaries. Sarah attempted a nervous intervention, but Joy's focus remained locked on Baldwin. Baldwin's legendary temper began showing its first visible signs, his jaw tightening as his famous intensity started to surface beneath his professional control. "My history of aggressive behavior," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "You're connecting things that have nothing to do with each other." The studio audience could feel the tension building as the respectful promotional atmosphere rapidly dissolved into something much more personal and hostile. Joy's aggressive smile suggested she was just getting started with her systematic attack on Hollywood's most vulnerable target. Joy's eyes showed clear satisfaction as she prepared to launch her most devastating attack yet. The pretense of discussing Baldwin's work had been completely abandoned, and everyone in the studio could sense that something far more personal and cruel was about to unfold. "Alec, let's talk about what really concerns me," Joy said, her voice taking on a tone that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Your credibility as someone who should be working in Hollywood right now. A woman is dead because of what happened on your set. How can you sit here promoting movies like nothing happened? The question hit the studio like a physical blow. The other hosts' faces showed immediate shock, and even the camera operators seemed to freeze. This was the kind of personal attack that crossed every professional boundary, weaponizing Baldwin's worst nightmare against him in the most public way possible. Baldwin's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The controlled composure cracked, replaced by something much more intense and dangerous. His voice, when he spoke, carried a tremor of genuine pain mixed with growing anger. "You think I don't think about that every single day?" he said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained emotion. "You think I don't carry that with me every moment? That was a tragic accident, and you're sitting here trying to use someone's death as a weapon against me." But Joy had clearly decided that respect for his pain was irrelevant to good television. She leaned forward even more aggressively, her voice rising with what seemed like manufactured outrage. "When someone dies on your watch, when you're the one holding the weapon, don't you think maybe you should step back from the spotlight instead of trying to continue your career like nothing happened? Don't you think that shows a complete lack of respect for what occurred?" The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what felt less like journalism and more like a public attack on someone's worst nightmare. What happened next would become one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. Joy's attack on Baldwin's tragedy and his right to work had pushed Hollywood's most outspoken star past every boundary of professional courtesy, and a legendary intensity that had made him famous was about to transform into something far more fierce and protective. "You want to talk about respect?" Baldwin fired back, his voice rising with an intensity that made everyone in the studio freeze. "You're sitting there using a woman's death as ammunition to attack me. You're exploiting a tragedy for your television show. And you want to lecture me about respect?" Joy's face flushed as she shot up from her chair, clearly believing she could push the volatile actor even further. "I'm holding you accountable for what happened. Someone died, Alec. Someone died because of decisions that were made on your set." Baldwin rose to meet her challenge, his presence filling the studio with an authority that was both magnetic and absolutely intimidating. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't lived with that every single day since it happened? But you're not holding me accountable. You're trying to destroy me for entertainment." The other hosts were completely paralyzed, afraid to intervene in what had become an all-out war between a television host and Hollywood's most controversial figure. The studio audience watched in shocked silence as the confrontation escalated beyond anything they had ever witnessed. "Some people shouldn't be allowed back in Hollywood after what they've done," Joy shot back, her voice cracking as she realized she might have awakened something dangerous. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what would become the most uncomfortable and personally devastating exchange in television history. The silence that followed Joy's devastating comment about Baldwin not being allowed back in Hollywood felt like it stretched on forever. The veteran actor stood there, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, his decades of professional experience warring with the raw pain of someone who had lived through unimaginable tragedy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that unmistakable Baldwin intensity mixed with genuine heartbreak. "You just showed everyone exactly who you are," he said, his words cutting through the studio like broken glass. "You take the worst moment of someone's life, the most tragic accident anyone could ever experience, and you use it as a club to beat them with. That's not journalism. That's sadism." Joy realized she had pushed too far, but instead of backing down, she made one final, desperate attack. "Alec, I'm just asking the questions that need to be asked about someone who was involved in a tragedy." Baldwin's voice exploded through the studio with a force that made everyone jump. "A woman lost her life in a horrible accident, and you're sitting here trying to use her death to end my career. You think that honors her memory? You think that's what justice looks like?" He began removing his microphone with swift, controlled movements, each action a clear statement that this conversation was over. Joy watched in growing panic as she realized her attack had completely backfired. "You can't just walk away when someone asks you to take responsibility," she called out desperately, her voice now noticeably shaking. Baldwin turned to face her one final time, and the look in his eyes was one of complete disgust mixed with profound sadness. Taking responsibility doesn't mean letting you use someone's death as entertainment. It means living with what happened every single day and trying to do better. With that, Alec Baldwin walked off the set with whatever dignity he could salvage, leaving Joy standing alone in the wreckage of what had once been a professional television studio. The silence that engulfed the View studio after Alec Baldwin's emotional exit was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. It was the kind of profound, uncomfortable quiet that follows a moral catastrophe, when everyone present realizes they've just witnessed someone's personal tragedy being exploited for television ratings. The only sounds were the mechanical hum of cameras still rolling and the horrified whispers of audience members who couldn't believe what had just been done to someone dealing with unimaginable circumstances. Joy stood frozen in place, her face cycling through expressions of defiance, confusion, and something that might have been the dawning realization of what she had just done. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked its earlier aggression, replaced by something that sounded almost desperate. "Well," she said, attempting to regain some control, "I think that reaction shows exactly why we need to ask these difficult questions about accountability and responsibility." But the other hosts' faces told a completely different story. Whoopi looked genuinely disturbed, her expression suggesting she couldn't believe what had just happened to someone who was clearly dealing with the worst experience of his life. Sarah appeared close to tears, and even Sunny seemed shaken by the unprofessional attack they had just witnessed. The studio audience sat in stunned disbelief, many shaking their heads in obvious disgust at what had transpired. Several audience members could be heard whispering, "That was cruel," and "The man's been through enough," their voices carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet studio. The production crew stood motionless, knowing they had just captured something that would be remembered as one of the most inappropriate moments in television history. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was the moment when someone's worst nightmare was used as ammunition against them. What you just witnessed wasn't accountability or tough journalism. It was a personal attack on someone's deepest pain, and Alec Baldwin's walk from that studio wasn't just an exit. It was a man defending his right to grieve and heal that will be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. And that's how Hollywood's most outspoken star went from cautious guest to defender of human dignity in less than 20 minutes. All because Joy Behar decided that exploiting Alec Baldwin's personal tragedy was more important than showing basic compassion to someone dealing with unimaginable circumstances. Baldwin's walk from that studio wasn't just an exit. It was someone refusing to let their worst nightmare become entertainment fodder. The question is, do you think Joy crossed the line by attacking someone's personal tragedy, or was she asking necessary questions about accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more moments that show what happens when hosts exploit personal pain for ratings. Until next time, remember, some tragedies should never be used as weapons against the people who live through them.